There is a quiet kind of betrayal that doesn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives wearing concern, responsibility, and the familiar voice of someone you once held as a baby. That was the kind of betrayal that found me. Before I take you deeper into this story, let me ask you something important. Where are you listening from right now? Are you driving through an American highway, sitting alone at home late at night, working a long shift, or resting with headphones on, letting someone else's story distract you from your own thoughts? Tell me in the comments, because these stories are meant to be shared, not hidden. And if you genuinely enjoy revenge stories rooted in reality, stories about dignity, patience, and quiet power, please like this video. Your likes truly motivate us to keep telling stories that matter, stories that feel human, not scripted. Now, let me introduce myself properly. My name is Alina Whitmore. I am 68 years old, born in Toledo, Ohio, and for most of my life, I believed that raising a good son was the safest investment a woman could ever make. I was never careless, never reckless. I worked nearly 40 years as a compliance officer for a mid-sized manufacturing firm, a job that taught me two things very well: how systems work and how people bend them when they think no one is watching. I lived modestly, saved deliberately, and invested slowly. No shortcuts, no gambling. When I finally sold my last rental property, one I'd owned since my early 40s, the proceeds, combined with decades of disciplined saving, left me with just over $2 million. Not lottery money, not flashy money, security money, peace of mind money. I never planned to spend it loudly. I didn't dream of yachts or luxury condos. I wanted stability, quiet mornings, medical security, and the freedom to age without fear. My son, Daniel, knew about the sale. Of course he did. I trusted him. He hugged me when I told him, smiled with pride, said, "You did everything right, Mom." He talked about how confusing finances had become, how dangerous the world was for older people, how scammers targeted women my age. He offered to help, not because I asked, but because he insisted. He spoke calmly, confidently, like someone who believed he was protecting something valuable. I didn't hear manipulation. I heard a son stepping into adulthood. What I didn't understand then, what took time and pain to recognize, was how easily love can be mistaken for authority, how silence can be taken as consent, and how quickly trust can be converted into control when someone believes you won't push back. At first, everything Daniel suggested sounded reasonable, almost comforting. He never rushed me, never raised his voice, never demanded anything outright. That was part of what made it so effective. He explained that sudden wealth, especially in the hands of someone my age, could attract legal trouble, predatory lawsuits, even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. He talked about temporary protection, short-term structures, and administrative safeguards, phrases delivered with the ease of someone who had rehearsed them long before speaking to me. He said the smartest move would be to place the funds into a holding structure, an LLC he could help manage, just until we set up a proper trust. He emphasized that nothing would really change, that I would still be the owner in every meaningful sense. "This is just paperwork, Mom," he said more than once. "You know how these things work. It's like locking the door before you go to sleep. You still own the house." He brought documents neatly organized in folders, highlighted sections, sticky notes marking where I needed to sign. I asked questions, real ones, not just polite nods, and he answered without hesitation, without irritation. When I mentioned involving my longtime accountant, he gently discouraged it, saying outside opinions would only complicate a simple process and slow things down. "I've already done the research," he assured me. "I wouldn't let anything happen to you." That sentence, "I wouldn't let anything happen to you," did more work than any contract ever could. I signed some papers, not all, just enough, he said, to get things started. A limited power of attorney for transactional efficiency. A co-signature clause only for emergency fund movement. Nothing felt final. Nothing felt dangerous. Weeks passed, then months. Daniel checked in regularly, always upbeat, always reassuring. He forwarded statements from advisors I'd never met but whose titles sounded impressive enough to quiet my instincts. "Everything's stable," he'd say. "Markets are shaky, but were positioned well. I believed him, because believing your child feels safer than doubting the world. Then one morning, when I tried to move a portion of my own money to cover a medical expense without consulting anyone, my bank account flagged the transaction. The woman on the phone sounded hesitant, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully, "you no longer have sole authorization on these funds." I remember sitting very still, the phone pressed against my ear, my kitchen suddenly too quiet. "What do you mean?" I asked. There was a pause, then words I would never forget. "The majority of the assets are now controlled by an entity where you are listed as a secondary beneficiary, not the primary decision maker." In that moment, nothing dramatic happened. No tears, no shouting, just a slow, sinking realization that somewhere along the way, my signature, given in trust, had been used to move me out of my own life. I did confront Daniel right away. That's something people often misunderstand when they hear stories like this. They assume anger comes first. It didn't. What came first was confusion, followed closely by a quiet, professional kind of fear. The kind you feel when you realize the rules have changed, but no one told you when. I spent that afternoon doing what I'd always done in my career when something didn't add up. I gathered information. I pulled every document I still had copies of, laid them out across my dining table, and read them slowly, line by line, not as a mother, but as the compliance officer I had been for most of my adult life. That's when patterns began to emerge. Clauses that shifted authority subtly. Language that looked temporary but wasn't. Signatures that initiated processes without clearly ending them. It was elegant in its construction, dangerously so. Daniel hadn't stolen from me outright. He had repositioned me, reduced my authority while keeping my name present enough to avoid immediate suspicion. When I called him that evening, I kept my voice calm. I told him the bank had flagged a transaction and asked him to explain. He laughed lightly, like I'd asked something silly. "Oh, that," he said. "Yeah, that's just the structure doing its job. Remember, we talked about this." I told him I didn't remember agreeing to lose control over my own money. His tone shifted, not sharply, but noticeably. "Mom," he said slowly, "you're overthinking this. These systems are complex. You hired me to handle this so you wouldn't have to stress." That word, hired, landed harder than he intended. I hadn't hired my son. I had trusted him. I asked for copies of the full operating agreement for the LLC. He hesitated, then said he'd send them later. He didn't. Over the next few days, his calls became shorter, his explanations more circular. He started using phrases like standard practice and industry norm, leaning on authority rather than clarity. And that's when the truth became unavoidable. Daniel hadn't just stepped into a role. I had been carefully, quietly pushed out of mine. The realization didn't break me. It steadied me. Because once you understand that someone close to you is treating your trust as leverage, the question is no longer why did they do this? The real question becomes how long have they assumed you wouldn't notice? That night after I hung up the phone with Daniel, I didn't sleep. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind had shifted into a familiar mode, assessment. The kind I used to slip into at work when a case landed on my desk that everyone else thought was routine, but something about it felt off. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and began writing, not emotionally, not dramatically, but methodically. Dates, names, document titles, phone calls. Every interaction I could remember, every promise that had been framed as protection. I replayed conversations in my head, this time listening not as a mother, but as a professional trained to hear what wasn't being said. I realized Daniel had never once used the word temporary in writing. He had spoken it, yes, often, but never committed it to paper. And in compliance work, spoken intentions mean nothing without documentation. By morning, I knew two things with certainty. First, this wasn't an accident. Second, confronting him directly without preparation would only give him time to adjust his position. So instead, I did something he never expected. I stayed quiet. I thanked him for handling things. I asked casual questions, the kind that sounded like curiosity, not suspicion. Meanwhile, I scheduled a consultation, not with a family friend, not with someone who knew Daniel, but with a forensic financial attorney 2 towns over, a woman whose reputation was built on unraveling exactly this kind of quiet overreach. I brought her everything. Every document, every email, every note I'd written the night before. She didn't interrupt while I spoke. She didn't react emotionally. She simply listened, occasionally asking me to clarify a date or repeat a phrase Daniel had used. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said something that still echoes in my mind. "Your son didn't steal your money. He isolated your authority. That's more dangerous." She explained that what Daniel had done fell into a gray area many families never challenge, using trust, access, and implied consent to consolidate control. But gray didn't mean legal. It just meant subtle. And subtle, she told me, leaves a trail. Walking out of that office, I didn't feel empowered yet. I felt focused. Because for the first time since the bank call, I understood that this wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about reclaiming agency and doing it in a way that couldn't be undone. The next phase required patience, something Daniel had always assumed I had in excess, mistaking it for passivity. I let that assumption work in my favor. Over the following weeks, I continued behaving exactly as he expected. I asked for updates. I thanked him for looking out for me. I even apologized once, casually, for being confused during that earlier phone call. I could almost hear his confidence returning through the receiver. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the attorney began her work. She requested records Daniel didn't know existed, internal filings, amendment histories, transactional metadata. She brought in a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing authority shifts rather than missing funds. That distinction mattered. This wasn't about money disappearing. It was about control being redirected. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened. Daniel had positioned himself as the sole managing member of the LLC, while my role had been reduced to a non-voting interest holder, still included, but effectively silenced. Compensation structures had been added that allowed him to pay himself management fees without my approval. Most revealing of all was a clause buried deep in an amendment filed 6 months after the initial setup, one I had never signed, that limited my ability to dissolve the entity without unanimous consent he controlled. When my attorney showed me that clause, I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, but clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan executed slowly enough that he believed it would go unnoticed. The attorney looked at me and said, "We can unwind this, but it has to be done carefully. If he senses resistance too early, he'll entrench himself." I nodded. I had spent a lifetime navigating systems designed to outmaneuver people who didn't read the fine print. I knew how this worked. That night, Daniel called to tell me about a great opportunity he was considering, an investment that required reallocating some of the funds. I listened, asked questions, even sounded impressed. Then I said something that made him pause. "Just make sure everything's documented properly," I said lightly. "I wouldn't want any confusion later." There was a beat of silence on the line before he agreed. In that pause, I heard something new in his voice, uncertainty. He didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. From that moment on, every move Daniel made worked against him, even though he didn't realize it yet. My attorney advised me not to rush toward confrontation or legal action. "Let him continue," she said. "People reveal the full shape of their intent when they believe they're still winning." So I let the process unfold. Daniel proceeded with the reallocation he'd mentioned, moving a portion of the funds through a secondary account under the LLC's authority. On paper, it looked routine. In reality, it crossed a critical line. By doing so without my informed consent, he created a clean, undeniable breach of fiduciary duty. The forensic accountant flagged it immediately. From there, the work accelerated quietly. Notices were prepared. Documentation was assembled. Timelines were cross-checked. The attorney explained that courts take a very dim view of family members who use emotional leverage to gain financial control, especially when the affected party is older. "This isn't just a civil matter," she told me. "It edges into elder financial abuse." Hearing that phrase applied to my own son was jarring, but not because it felt wrong. It was jarring because it felt accurate. Still, I said nothing to Daniel. I let him continue believing he was steering the ship. When he started calling less frequently, I knew he felt secure. He assumed my earlier hesitation had passed, that I'd settled back into the role he was comfortable with, the mother who trusted, who deferred, who didn't challenge. Meanwhile, I signed documents that he didn't know about. I revoked powers. I authorized audits. I initiated a court-monitored review of the LLC's governance structure. Each step was lawful, measured, and irreversible. The most important moment came when my attorney asked me a simple question. Do you want this corrected quietly, or do you want accountability? I didn't answer right away. I thought about Daniel as a child, about the pride I'd felt watching him succeed, about the trust I'd given him without hesitation. Then I thought about that bank call, the woman's careful voice telling me I no longer had authority over my own life. I want it corrected, I said finally, but I want it corrected in a way he can't repeat. The paperwork went in the following week. Daniel would be notified formally, not as my son, but as a managing party under investigation. The official notice reached Daniel on a Tuesday morning. I know this because he called me less than an hour later, his voice tight in a way I had never heard before, not angry, not confident, but strained, like someone trying to keep control of a situation that was already slipping through his fingers. "Mom," he said, skipping every formality, "did you hire a lawyer?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence do the work I once rushed to do for him. "Yes," I said calmly. "I did." He laughed, but it sounded forced, brittle. "Why would you do that? This is a family matter." That word, family, used now as a shield, landed differently than it once would have. "Family matters are exactly why I did," I replied. He tried to explain, to reframe, to soften what had already been documented. He talked about stress, responsibility, pressure. He said he'd only wanted to protect me from making mistakes, from being overwhelmed. I listened without interrupting, without correcting him, because I had learned something important over the past weeks. People reveal their deepest beliefs when they think they're justifying themselves. When he finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I told him the truth. "You didn't protect me," I said evenly. "You replaced me." That stopped him. I could hear his breathing on the line, uneven now. He asked what this meant legally. I told him there would be a formal review, that the entity controlling the funds was being examined for governance violations, and that my authority was already in the process of being restored. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "I built this structure." I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself. "No," I said. "You built it around me, and that's why it's coming apart." He accused me of overreacting, of being influenced by outsiders, of forgetting who had been there for me. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply told him the next steps would go through my attorney and ended the call. When the line went dead, I felt something unexpected, not guilt, not fear, but a quiet sense of alignment. For the first time in a long while, my actions matched my understanding. And that, I realized, was where real power begins. The days that followed felt strangely calm, almost deceptive in their normalcy. Daniel didn't call again. Instead, communication shifted where it belonged, onto letterhead, into formal language, stripped of the emotional shortcuts he'd relied on for years. My attorney forwarded me copies of everything: the request for records, the notice of governance review, the temporary injunction preventing any further movement of funds. Reading those documents was surreal. My name appeared not as a passive party, not as someone to be protected, but as the primary authority, the way it should have been all along. Behind the scenes, the pressure on Daniel intensified. Financial institutions began requesting clarifications he couldn't easily provide. Advisors who once returned his calls within minutes suddenly deferred everything to legal counsel. The LLC's internal structure, so carefully designed to give him leverage, was now being examined under a microscope. Here's the thing about scrutiny: systems built on confidence rather than consent rarely survive it. I learned later that Daniel tried to explain it all away, insisting there had been no malicious intent, that everything was done for my benefit. But intent doesn't override documentation, and courts don't reward good intentions when power has been misused. One afternoon, my attorney called to tell me the $2 million, the full amount, had been effectively frozen pending final resolution. "He can't touch it," she said. Not a dollar. I hung up and sat quietly in my living room, looking around at the life I'd built piece by piece. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded, because what was happening wasn't punishment, it was correction. Daniel was being forced to confront something he'd never truly faced before: limits. The kind that don't bend for charm or explanation. And somewhere in that process, I understood something else too. This wasn't just about reclaiming money. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own life story. One decision, one boundary, one documented truth at a time. By the time the review reached its final stage, the emotional distance between Daniel and me felt wider than any physical space ever could. Weeks passed without a single personal message from him. No late-night calls, no attempts to explain, no appeals to memory or sentiment. What remained were facts. Clean, unmovable facts. The court-appointed examiner concluded what my attorney had known from the beginning. Daniel had exceeded his authority, misrepresented the nature of my consent, and structured control in a way that deliberately limited my ability to intervene. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't cruel. It was precise. The kind of judgment that leaves no room for interpretation. My authority was formally restored. The LLC was dissolved under supervision. The funds were transferred into a trust where I held exclusive control, with strict safeguards preventing any single individual, family or otherwise, from ever overriding my decisions again. When Daniel finally did reach out, it wasn't with anger. It was with a short email, carefully written, stripped of accusation. He said he hadn't realized how far he'd gone until the system pushed back. He said he thought he was being responsible. I read the message more than once, then closed my laptop. Understanding, I've learned, doesn't undo harm, but it does end denial. I didn't reply right away, not out of spite, but because some silences are necessary. I needed time to let the weight of what had happened settle, not just legally, but personally. I had trusted my son with my future, and that trust had been reshaped into something transactional. Accepting that truth was painful, but it was also clarifying. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even disappointed. I was awake. And once that happens, you don't rush to soothe the people who benefited from your sleep. The end of this chapter didn't arrive with celebration, reconciliation, or dramatic speeches. It arrived quietly, the way real turning points usually do. The paperwork was finalized. The trust was secured. The $2 million, money I had earned slowly, carefully, honestly, was fully restored under my sole authority, protected in a way that no one could ever again reinterpret as theirs to manage for my own good. My days grew simpler after that. Mornings returned to routine. Decisions no longer required permission or explanation, and the silence that once felt heavy now felt earned. Daniel and I speak rarely now, and when we do, the conversation stays within clearly drawn boundaries. There is sadness in that, of course. There always is when love collides with entitlement, but there is no confusion. I didn't lose a son. I lost an illusion. The illusion that love automatically protects you. The illusion that family will never test your limits. The illusion that age means surrender. What I gained instead was something far more valuable than money: clarity. I learned that dignity doesn't come from being agreeable, and strength doesn't require shouting. Sometimes, the most powerful thing an older woman can do is stop explaining herself. If there is one truth I carry forward, it's this: your silence is not consent, your patience is not weakness, and your trust is not a blank check. No matter how old you are, no matter who stands across from you, you always have the right to reclaim your place, your voice, and your future. And when you do, the reckoning doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be final. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever trusted someone who quietly crossed a line, remember this: protecting yourself is not betrayal, and setting boundaries is not cruelty. Awareness is strength, especially when it arrives later in life. If you value stories about dignity, clarity, and real-life reckonings, subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub. Here, we tell stories that remind you one simple truth: you are never too old to take your power back.